Welcome back to Conservative Conversations. I'm your host, Reid.
And I'm Frank.
Today we're going to be briefly talking about the upcoming debates, the economy, and the Supreme Court. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you to subscribe on our YouTube channel, and you can also follow us on your favorite podcast platform. We'd greatly appreciate it. And to start off real quick, we're going to talk about the big debates coming up. It's the first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. It should be pretty interesting. And if you listen to our other channel, the Wiki Wacky Radio Show, we're going to be having our own great debate. So look out for that later in the evening on the same day this episode comes out. A lot of people are, well, especially for the Republicans, have pretty low expectations for Joe Biden's performance. I kind of think works against Trump a little bit because that, he doesn't have to clear a very high bar, so as long as he does moderately well, people might, see him kind of as a winner. But I guess we'll find out on Thursday the 27th, the day after this episode, if you listen to when it comes out.
I can't wait to see it. I mean, like we talked about previously, Trump has proved his stamina.
Right.
He can stand a 90-minute debate.
Right.
So it'll be really interesting to see how Joe does perform.
Yep, sure will be. And then to move on to our first topic, I got a little mixed bag about the economy. One of the things, or a couple of things I've heard recently, Donald Trump has mentioned that he is floating the idea of getting rid of taxes on tip wages. If you're like a waiter or waitress, you receive like cash tips and stuff like that. Or I suppose any other kind of tips, even if it's through like, your Ubers or your DoorDash people, which has certainly sparked somewhat of a conversation, particularly among like economists and people who cover business and stuff like that. I haven't quite decided how I feel about it. In a way, I think it kind of plays favors to the particular type of workers because, people who receive your traditional wages through like payroll and stuff that don't get tips, they don't really see any kind of benefit. But another argument I heard that I think makes sense is, how much do people really report their tips that they get? It's believed that it's not, most people don't report the full amount that they get in tips when they're doing their taxes. So it's almost pointless to tax the tips when people don't accurately report how much they get. But I think one of the reasons why Trump mentioned it was, kind of help win some minority votes, because a lot of minorities work in service industries where they receive tips and stuff like that, which politically is not, not a bad play. I'm sure a lot of those people would like to not have to pay taxes on their tips that they get. But I just thought it was kind of an interesting idea that he's floating out there.
Well, I definitely have a few things to say about that. I didn't know if you wanted to hit some of your other points.
No, you can go say what you got on that.
Well, I used to be an income tax return preparer, and if you look at how much somebody makes who's in a tipped position, like let's just say a waitress, okay, at a coffee shop or something like that, they only make $3 an hour or something to that effect, So if you do full time for a year, I mean, we're not talking big bucks,
right.
And usually, well, first of all, there's the point that the IRS says that you have to report all worldwide income. If you find $20 on the sidewalk, you're supposed to report it. Now, whether or not people do or underreport their tips, that's sort of its own issue. But there are other reasons why somebody would, if you're trying to, okay, let's say this. If you ever want to get Social Security, for instance, you would want to beef up the wages that you've paid over your lifetime. Not the wages, but the taxes that you've paid into Social Security over your lifetime. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you wanted unemployment, you'd want, do you want to just be paid based off of the 315 that you are made on your hourly wage, right?
Right. Yeah.
What about certain taxes and tax benefits, like the child tax credit? You have to make $3,000 to even qualify for the child tax credit. And then still, if all you've made in a year is $3,000, you still don't qualify for the child tax credit, because that just opens the door. Then it's based off of your total income until you hit a certain threshold or ceiling, So it just seems to me that there's a lot of reasons why people would want to claim their tips and not just cut out a large portion of their income from being taxed. I mean, in one way it does sound nice, especially to somebody in a lower, socioeconomic position or job.
Sure.
But in reality, there are more benefits to claiming the income.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that, so that was a good way of looking at it. One thing I would think about is, like, from the business aspect, if your employee is making a decent amount of tips and they don't have to worry about paying taxes on them, I mean, that kind of goes towards, what wage should they be paying them hourly? Because the tips they get help offset their hourly rate. So, you would think. So that kind of, I think, would make it a little more difficult trying to figure out the proper actual, hourly wage to pay him.
Well, it also seems to me that it could be counterintuitive. Like, okay, if this is something that the general public really likes the idea of, would we see more, minimum wage type positions become tipped positions?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I don't think that would really be good in the long term.
Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting idea that Trump had floated out at one of his campaign stops. It'll be interesting to see if it actually gets done if he becomes the president. But the next thing related to the economy is the difference in corporate tax rates. Joe Biden has proposed setting it at 28%. Trump has recently said he'd like to lower it to 20%, because I think it's 21 right now, which also has an impact on people's wages. Coming back to that, because we've talked about in the past about how increasing the corporate tax rate can impact their prices and the margins for the businesses, which eventually passes the prices down to the consumers, and the consumers are the workers, people who, if you even want to go back to the last one, the people working for tips. I mean, they gotta go eventually pay higher prices at the stores, which negatively impacts how much they've earned, essentially, over their take-home pay. Well, I shouldn't really say take-home pay, but how much they have at the end of the month. I think that's a simple way to put it.
Yeah.
So I thought that was another interesting thing to keep an eye out for, see what might happen with that. Because I did hear one thing from listening to the Fox Business Rundown podcast. One analyst that they were interviewing mentioned how even if the tax rate does go up to 28%, a lot of businesses are, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess creative, simple way to put it. Creative ways to find out how to, increase their margins even with the increased tax rate. So at least there's some kind of optimism look towards it. That's good businesses will find a way to make it work for them.
Well, yeah. And still, on sort of the flip side of that coin, I bet if it were lowered, 1%'s just a drop in the bucket, I think, but that still isn't going to curb the trend. Prices are still being passed to the consumer, prices are still going up. So I'm not an advocate for much higher corporate tax rate, but I don't think that it would ruin us or anything either.
Right, yeah. And lastly, this is more of a kind of a criticism towards some Republicans I've heard while, talking about the economy, and they like to use this kind of example, as they say it in many different ways, but like a single mom with 2 kids has to make the choice between putting food on her table or gas in her car, that kind of thing.
Right.
And, Democrats do similar things, but whenever I hear that, my first thought is, I don't really buy that. That's really taken place very often. I'm sure you can probably pick out some cases where people have to make a choice like that. But I would stop and ask, well, what's the rest of their money going to? How comes nobody's saying they have to choose between, food or their expensive cable and internet package?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say, is how many of them have Disney Plus?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all these streaming services and, all these other discretionary things that...
Yeah, how many times a week do they buy pizza?
Right, yeah. I mean...
Drive through McDonald's.
Exactly. At a certain point, you got to ask, well, what exactly are they spending their money on if the choice is food or gas in the car to go get the food?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of silly to me, and one of those negative things I don't particularly enjoy seeing from Republicans and conservatives, but, it's one of those kind of talking points, and more, I don't really want to say extreme, but,
just maybe not effective or
right, yeah,
something. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because I don't really find it effective.
Well, because I think on the other side, like you say, this is sort of like a new version of an old complaint. Mm-hmm. And usually they talk about seniors, and they have to make a decision between, are they going to buy groceries or pay for their medicine that they have to take, something like. Mm-hmm. But that makes more sense because their retirees are on a limited budget. Maybe all you get is your Social Security check.
Right, yeah.
And it's not like some 99-year-old woman in a wheelchair can go out and pick up an extra job.
Right, yeah.
But a mom in a household, maybe she's got a boy who's 16 who could take on a job, or maybe she's got a few hours in the morning and a few hours at night. She could be Ubering people around or something like that. So, I mean, they have options. It's not like anybody's got a gun to their head or...
Yeah, that's a good point too. I mean, particularly, younger people, like you mentioned, not these retirees who do have fixed incomes and can't really do too much about their economic situation. But other people, they can either cut their spending in places they don't need it, or they can go out and find ways to increase their income a lot more easily than other people can.
Right.
So I think it's kind of silly, because I heard it even recently. I believe it was Steve Scalise on one of the Fox News Rundown episodes I listened to. He gave that kind of example. And I don't like hearing it. It just rubs me the wrong way, because in some aspects it doesn't really account for, personal responsibility and choice to what they're doing.
Well, I totally get where you're coming from. I mean, I know that especially, for certain people out there, that tough decisions are being made right now. The economy is not that great.
Right. Well, like I said, I'm sure there are some cases like that, but to push that kind of example around so much to make it seem like it's almost every single mom out there.
Right.
Yeah, I don't buy it, and I don't really care to hear of it.
Well, just to point this out, I think we live in an age where money's been easy. It's an easy money policy from the top down. And, through the pandemic, people got checks to sit at home and do nothing. And they made it so that unemployment was not taxable, which blows my mind still. So I think people are just sort of used to these handouts. And maybe if we, sort of complain loud enough and long enough, maybe somebody will write me a check.
Right, yeah. I wouldn't be surprised.
I'm just saying, I don't think that the mentality has helped, the sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure there are those kinds of people out there. There's probably some mom who's working 3 part-time jobs to support her kids.
Mm-hmm.
But I bet there's a lot more who would rather just complain.
Right. Yeah. But that's all I really had on my little variety pack of economy-related stories.
Well, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Some very interesting points in there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to move it over to something I found very interesting, I just saw that Andrew Cuomo, you remember him, the former governor
of New York?
Yes, and he was also the former attorney general.
Right.
I want to point that out.
Yep.
What was his brother's name? Do you remember?
Chris Cuomo?
Chris. Oh, yeah, who had the television show on, what was it, MSNBC or CNN? Probably CNN.
I think it was CNN.
Yeah, CNN sounds right.
Yeah, Chris Cuomo. I say it like I did because oftentimes I find myself when I try to say Chris Cuomo's name, if I don't slow down, it's Chris Cuomo.
Well, anyway, Andrew Cuomo, the older brother, he was on Bill Maher's show recently, and he said something very interesting. He was talking about the New York case against Trump, you know, where he was just found guilty on those 34 counts or whatever.
Right.
I always forget what the number was of counts, but he was talking about how this case is political in nature. He just came out and said it. It is political in nature. Mm-hmm. And he was saying even in New York where nobody likes Trump, that was his words, I guess he has access to some kind of polling, or maybe there's some poll that I'm not aware of, but he said 66% of New Yorkers believe that case was political in nature. And he said, even in a place where nobody likes Trump, 66% of people think that this was political. So I found that to be very interesting and very telling. And it reminded me, I mean, there was this other fella, I don't have his name here in my notes, but he was on the Bill Maher show too. And his jaw, I mean, you could see in his face, he was shocked that he was hearing that come out of Andrew Cuomo's mouth.
Right.
But it kind of reminded me of when they brought Michael Avenatti. I can't remember somebody. It was Ari Fleischer or Ari Miller or whatever his name is.
Ari Fleischer.
Mm-hmm. He did a phone interview with that Michael Avenatti. Mm-hmm. Now this has been a couple weeks back or whatever, but even Michael Avenatti, he said, "Well, I think I'm going to shock everybody with what I'm about to say, but this case is a little stale, you know. These events go back 8 years,
right.
And if anything, this should have been brought by the feds, not in the state of New York."
Mm-hmm. Right, and he was once Stormy Daniels' lawyer.
Right, exactly.
So that's another important note.
Well, that's what it reminded me of anyway. I mean, just the way this other guy, whose name I don't know, his jaw about hit the floor. You can see it in his face. But Bill Maher, though, he didn't miss a beat. He picked right up on it, and he called it a fundraising bonanza. And he pointed out the fact that, you know, prior to that verdict, apparently the Trump campaign was sort of lagging behind the Biden campaign as far as donations and that kind of thing. But now, ever since, Trump has pulled way ahead. I mean, like we've talked about, he's been getting donations from all over the country, from just little people, just $10, $20, and $50 donations, because people can see this for what it is. And I found it very interesting that Cuomo, of all people,
right,
would come out and say that 66% of New Yorkers see this as a political hit job, basically. I mean, those are my words, but...
Right. Yeah, that is pretty interesting. I hadn't heard about that. And Andrew Cuomo is no fan of Trump.
I know.
Yeah. So
but he is a fan of New York, though.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that he would not only can read the writing on the wall for himself, but would do Bill Maher's show and say this out loud to people. I heard one analyst say that if Andrew Cuomo weren't already out of office, he would be now.
Yeah. That's funny.
I thought that was pretty funny too, yeah.
Yeah, because it seems like if he, one, didn't believe it, or two, simply wanted to hide that fact, he didn't even need to mention it. The fact that 66% of New Yorkers think it's, a politically motivated trial or case. I mean, they could just try to obscure that and make it seem like everybody thinks, it's right, it's all kosher. But here he is on Bill Maher's show, who's not a nobody, saying it right out loud.
Well, and I think it's very telling because of these times that we live in. Mm-hmm. It's one of these things where Trump, you either love him or hate him. That's been around for a while.
Yep.
But good men, and it's an interesting thing to say about Andrew Cuomo, but
sure,
good men do care about the rule of law, and to see our justice system perverted just to get one political adversary is totally antithetical to what America is.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm no big Andrew Cuomo fan, but for anybody with a background like his to come out and speak the truth is amazing.
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful. And there have been others. Andrew Cuomo is not the only one who hates Trump, but has come out and said that this is a political hit job.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, credit where credit's due. Good for Andrew Cuomo.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess speaking of justice system, will take us right into our next topic, which is the Supreme Court. This week, as you're listening to the episode, is supposed to be the opinion decision for the Trump v. United States case, which is a Trump immunity case, as most people know it.
Right.
If I had to guess, it's probably going to be the last one they release at the end of the day on Friday, given that it's such a hot topic and a pretty big one.
They do like to do that, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
The weekend dump.
Right. And for what I wanted to talk about and regarding the Supreme Court was how even recently Joe Biden has talked about how it's such a radical and extreme court, and he's made similar comments in the past about the court. And I tried to look up like a big list of cases and how they were decided, like 9-0, 7-2 or whatever, just to see roughly how many between the October 2021 term to the October term that started last fall, that's about to end at the end of this week. But a list like that was not easy to find. In my attempts to find it, I did learn a few things. There are tons and tons of random cases that come before the court that sometimes don't even get fully heard, sometimes get rejected, sometimes the justices agree on the whole thing, sometimes they agree only on parts, sometimes they dissent to only parts, and all that in between. So it actually made it kind of hard to really find out exact, clear-cut rulings, because sometimes they're not. And there's plenty of cases that have certainly no direct effect on people. A lot of them are businesses suing businesses, the states suing other states, like California sued Texas, Florida sued Georgia for something, the territory of Guam sued the United States. It's a whole tons of stuff that you wouldn't even think about, you don't even hear about. It really has nothing to do with most of our day-to-day lives, and they certainly get decided on in all sorts of ways. So I thought that was interesting to think that there's all these cases that go on that nobody ever even hears about and have little to no impact on us, but yet somehow we got a radical and extreme court. Because if, at least in my view, if we did, they would really only focus on stuff that might benefit them or benefit the supposed party in power and stuff like that. But that's not the case. Even just recently, one of the opinions they had was regarding a piece of gun control legislation. I forget from what state, but it had to do, I believe, with restricting access to, I think purchasing of firearms if somebody has like a restraining order against them or something like that. Mm-hmm. Well, it was decided 8-1 in favor of the policy, the more gun control leaning policy. Now, if it was such a radical court to the right, they probably would have decided it the other way, but they didn't. What else was I going to say?
That is shocking to me, though, the 8-1 on that.
Right. Well, I guess it kind of, for me, it depends on what the actual issue was. Because maybe I think it might make sense. But
well, I'm sure you could make sense out of it, but I just think that the Second Amendment's pretty clear cut.
Right? Yeah. Well, I guess that kind of, I think, kind of goes towards what I'm saying. A lot of people would believe that it is, but it seems in this case, the vast majority of the court.
No, I get it. I mean, because that's the way we've been trending is right. Towards these sort of red flag laws, as they call them. So, right. I mean, I could see that this goes into the same vein as like, if you have a mental health problem, maybe we shouldn't sell you a gun. If you're actively threatening your ex-wife or soon-to-be ex-wife, right. Maybe you shouldn't get a gun. Right. I mean, I get where they're coming from. I'm sure it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, but the Second Amendment says the right to bear arms, basically the right to defend yourself, shall not be infringed. Yeah. So, I mean, that's pretty clear cut.
Yeah. But I just, it's another thing is usually, I mean, there's probably, let me back up here. Now, and one of the other things is, when Joe Biden and some other Democrats criticize the Supreme Court, they're usually criticizing it as a whole, as the body, whereas at least from what I've seen, a lot of Republicans usually criticize the individual justices for what they think are wrong opinions and wrong decisions and stuff like that. I mean, rarely I hear a Republican try to condemn the whole court as a institution, say it's basically trying to say it's rotten and needs to be overhauled, or packed with more justices that they get to pick all the time. And this is stuff we've sort of talked about before when we've talked about the Supreme Court, how the two different sides view it differently and stuff like that.
Well, we do like to cover the Supreme Court, and, I think it's a very interesting point that you bring up. I mean, to me, it makes a lot of sense that they hear a lot of cases that aren't exactly newsworthy, because it seems like it's, I mean, in a manner of speaking, I think I've even loosely said it here on the channel before, that it seems like all they take on are these big political, or these big newsworthy cases. Right. But that's not true. It's just, those are the ones you hear about.
Right, yeah.
But I can tell you, in my lifetime, there's only like a handful, maybe less, that really stand out as being controversial. And, one of them, we've just hit the 2-year anniversary for the overturn of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, with the Dobbs decision.
Yeah, that's one. Controversial, right?
Right, yeah.
Citizens United, very controversial. I still, after all these years, I don't know how I feel about Citizens United still. But what's the other one? The Offermed case, or whatever it was, that gave gay people the right to marry. That one was controversial. That was an Obama era thing.
Yeah.
Could you remember the name of that one?
Obergefell?
Obergefell. Yeah, I can never remember that. But I think, that's really about all I can think of here on the spot.
Right,
as being big, hugely controversial cases.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think there's also, one of my long-standing complaints about the Supreme Court though, is I think there's a lot of cases that don't get heard that should be.
Sure.
I mean, according to the Constitution, every citizen has the right to appeal their case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I think it's shameful that they often have a backlog, you know? I mean, they're human beings. There's only so many cases they can hear in a year. I understand the limits. But theoretically speaking, they ought to hear every case that's appealed up to them. And I think it's shameful sometimes that they'll just let cases sit. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. But to bring up my last point, it's also on the Supreme Court. Something that I've been hoping for a long time now. Now, this is going to be controversial, I'm sure. But I also think that it needs to happen. And I've just heard that they're going to be hearing a case in the fall. It's going to be called U.S. versus Scarametti. I hope I'm saying that right. It's a weird name. But they're going to be hearing a case based off of a Tennessee law that bans gender-affirming care for minors.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, don't you think that's something that needs to be set straight?
Yeah.
I really do too.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently there are a bunch of states that have such bans. Some portions have been struck down while others remain.
Mm-hmm.
Like some states have banned the sex change surgeries.
Right.
But they allow for the hormonal treatments, and you can still give cross-sex hormones and that kind of thing, these gender blockers or puberty blockers.
Right, yeah.
So I think it's going to be good to get some real clarification on this.
Right.
I have hope because I like the complexion of the court right now as it stands, sort of 6-3, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, it often doesn't fall that way. You get these surprises.
Right. Yeah.
But I see this, hopefully, as a 6-3 slam dunk case. Now, I'm not that well versed on it, and,
Sure.
I'll probably be shocked, and hopefully not. But I just am really looking forward to this because I feel like there's so much disinformation out there, and so many people are just on board with this stuff.
Yeah.
And something needs to wake people up and say, no, this is
Right.
wrong. You can't do this to a minor child.
Right.
But there's a bunch of people who are joining in on this. There's this celebrity. We all remember her as Ellen Page, but
Oh, yeah.
now she's
Elliot Page.
converting about as a male. Yeah, Elliot Page. Well, this person has joined a legal filing in support of the review to help draw attention to it and, that kind of thing. And I don't know. I just think it's something that really does, there's a reason they're going to take this up.
Right.
Because as of the latest thing that I saw, there are 25 states that have laws restricting or banning this gender-affirming care. So it's something that really is, we're almost split, 25 and 25.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm just, like I said, I'm very hopeful about it. I'm hoping it'll shed some light, maybe some good conversations, some good debates will come out of this.
Right. Yeah.
And, there are certain hearts and minds that'll never be changed.
Of course.
But hopefully it'll be an opportunity to really make people dig down deep within themselves and consider things like, we've talked about it before, but we don't let a 17-year-old vote. We don't let a 17-year-old buy cigarettes. We don't let a 17-year-old buy alcohol.
Right.
Why are we going to let them lop off body parts?
Yeah.
And
what almost amounts to genetically altering their body with these hormones and puberty blockers.
Yeah.
Or artificially altering.
Right,
them.
because you get into the sterilization issue. That's crazy. This is... I didn't expect myself to say this, but if you go back and look at the sort of experiments that the Nazis were doing, this is the kinds of stuff that they were doing, forced sterilization and stuff. Now, this is optional, but, we don't believe that a minor child can make these kinds of decisions.
Right.
Traditionally. So the idea that we can, under the guise of their own choice, allow them to sterilize themselves, it's
right.
It's insane.
Right. I know it's kind of a really low-level argument, but kids believe in all sorts of things. One of the kind of big ones is the Santa Claus example.
Right.
Some kids kind of believe in Santa Claus for quite a few years into their childhood. And of course that, sometimes they believe they want to be astronauts or firemen. And of course by the time they're in their late teens or becoming adults, they're not interested in that at all. So what if we had, this is kind of silly to say too, but what if we had forced them into being firefighters and astronauts when they got older, despite the fact that at a certain point they don't want to do that anymore?
That's right. You signed a contract at 5 years old.
You said you wanted to be a firefighter.
You've got to be a firefighter.
Johnny. Right. That'd be silly.
Well, and I don't think that your argument is exactly low-hanging fruit either, because one of the things I would point out to you is, obviously there's a difference in children and human beings,
sure.
Right? And some people catch on to the fact that they're being told a fib earlier than other people might.
Sure.
But you also have to look at how the parents are presenting this. Mm-hmm. And if the parents are totally in love with Santa Claus and the tradition of Santa Claus, and they don't even give their children gifts, it's just all from Santa, and it's all, and they build such a culture and such a family tradition around Santa Claus, then I could see how you could have a child at 18 still wanting to believe in Santa, right. Because it's part of their upbringing. It's part of their sort of family faith, if you will.
Sure.
And I've often wondered about that. If I had a child, I don't really believe in Santa. Of course I don't. Right. But I also I don't think that it's really a good lie to be telling people. I don't really understand the tradition of Santa Claus. I get it historically and all of that sort of stuff. But I've often wondered to myself, at what point would I sit, little Johnny down and explain to him, okay, this Santa Claus thing's getting a little old. These gifts come from your mom and I.
Yeah, right.
Come on.
Right, because I don't really ever remember being told that Santa Claus wasn't real. I feel like at a certain point you just kind of figure it out.
Yeah, well, me too. I think, in a way, that's part of the fun part of childhood and, moving up into adulthood and being able to think for yourself. And,
right.
We caught my parents, we'd often find the gifts in the house before... Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden it's from Santa. Well, how come it's been sitting in my house for a month if it's from Santa and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
But I don't know. If you had this is the point I'm trying to make here. If you had a very innocent child who really believed in Santa and wasn't very questioning and wasn't a very good critical thinker,
right.
Wouldn't you at some point want to help them break out of that? And at what point do you want to have a 32-year-old son who believes in Santa Claus?
Right,
that just doesn't seem healthy.
Right. It's because nobody else, the normality of people, if that's even the right way to say it, normally people that age don't believe in those kinds of things anymore. Mm-hmm. And you'd be seen as, odd, to say the least, I guess, if we're believing in Santa Claus at 32 years old. People think something's wrong.
Right. Well, and that's why, again, just to take it back to this case, I'm excited about this because I feel like the trend that we've seen is antithetical to what most people believe.
Right.
And I think so many people have just been easygoing about this, be who you want to be and accept yourself and love yourself and all that.
Right.
Which is nice. It sounds very Christian, but it's wrong.
Right.
And I think we all know it's wrong, and I think it's time. It's time.
Right. Yeah, definitely. It'll be good to finally get some clear answers on this issue. It can't come soon enough. It probably won't be until next summer when we hear about it. But I guess that's a couple of little facts that I did learn about the Supreme Court that I wanted to mention real quick. Even the attorneys arguing the cases, they don't hear about the decided opinions basically until the rest of us do.
Well, that makes sense.
Yep. Which, yeah, like you said, makes sense, but I never really thought about it like that. One might think they'd get a little heads up or be some of the first people notified about it. But pretty much the court releases their opinion to everybody at once, even the attorneys on the case. But I guess that's all we got on the Supreme Court. The decision on the Trump immunity case should be coming out soon. And as we mentioned before, the court is certainly not as radical as Biden and some Democrats make it out to be. Well, listeners, if you enjoyed this great conversation, we hope you go follow us on your favorite podcast platform. My tongue's been all tied today. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, and many more. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can just search at Conservative Conversations 92. We would greatly appreciate it.
We hope you might share us with a friend or two. And as always, we thank you for listening.